The room looks the same, but something in you has gone quiet. The phone is face down on the table, and still your hand keeps reaching for it. Not because you expect a miracle, not because you believe the next message will solve everything. It's more primitive than that. Your body has learned the rhythm of waiting, and now it waits even when your mind is tired of it. You tell yourself you are fine. You tell yourself you are detached. You tell yourself you are not the kind of woman who gets pulled into fantasies. And yet, there is still a small, private ache in the chest when the screen stays dark. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Not the obvious heartbreak, not the dramatic ending, not the argument, the silence, the distance, the mixed signals. The deeper pain is what happens after all of that, when the story no longer feeds you clearly, but you still cannot fully let it go. You are no longer inside the relationship, but you are not fully outside it either. You are standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, looking into a room that no longer belongs to you. That is where fantasy becomes dangerous, because fantasy does not always feel like fantasy. Sometimes it feels like hope. Sometimes it feels like intuition. Sometimes it feels like loyalty, or spiritual meaning, or emotional depth. Sometimes it feels like the only thing keeping you from becoming hard. And that is exactly why it can hold on so tightly. It offers you a story that is softer than reality, and if your heart has been bruised enough times, softness can feel like survival. But there is a difference between tenderness and escape. There is a difference between holding compassion in your heart and building a private world in which the other person becomes more real than what is actually happening. One keeps you human, the other slowly removes you from your own life. You may not notice the shift at first. It begins innocently. You replay a conversation. You reread a message. You assign meaning to a pause, a glance, a delay, a memory. You tell yourself there must be something deeper here because the surface explanation hurts too much. And maybe there is something deeper. But the deeper layer is not always romance. Sometimes the deeper layer is projection. Carl Jung understood something many people still resist. The unconscious does not only create dreams. It also creates relationships that carry our hidden material. We do not simply meet people. We meet what our psyche is ready to place onto them. We meet our expectations, our wounds, our unmet needs, our unlived possibilities, our hunger to be seen, our fear of being ordinary, our longing to be chosen without having to ask. That is why fantasy can feel so magnetic. It is not just about the person in front of you. It is about the inner image they awaken. And once an inner image has been awakened, it can become difficult to separate the real person from the psychological role they have begun to play in your mind. You may think you are attached to them, but sometimes you are attached to what they symbolize: safety, redemption, recognition, a second chance at being loved in the exact place where you once felt invisible, a proof that the pain of your past did not mean what it seemed to mean, a secret hope that this time, if you wait long enough, the ending will be different. This is where the heart becomes vulnerable to fantasy, not because it is weak, but because it is trying to heal. And yet healing cannot happen through a story that keeps you suspended. There is a moment in every emotional attachment when the body knows more than the mind is willing to admit. You feel it in the stomach when you open the chat. You feel it in the shoulders when you see their name. You feel it in the strange alertness that comes when a door might open, a message might arrive, a sign might appear. The body does not respond like that to nothing. It responds because something inside you has been trained to associate this person with relief, even if relief never fully comes. That is why leaving the fantasy can feel almost like grief, because you are not only letting go of a person, you are letting go of a future that never happened. You are letting go of the version of yourself who believed that if she just understood enough, waited enough, loved enough, softened enough, stayed open enough, then the missing piece would finally reveal itself. You were letting go of an internal movie that gave your pain a shape. And this is where people often harden. They confuse clarity with coldness. They think the only way to leave fantasy is to become numb, suspicious, closed, superior, untouchable. They build armor and call it wisdom. They stop feeling in order not to be fooled again. They cut off tenderness because tenderness once led them into disappointment. They decide that a guarded heart is the price of self-respect. But a heart can be clear without becoming rigid. You do not have to become bitter to become awake. That is the deeper invitation here. Not to kill your softness, not to erase your longing, not to punish yourself for having hoped, The invitation is to separate tenderness from self-abandonment, to understand that a woman can be open without being available to confusion, compassionate without being consumed, receptive without making a shrine out of uncertainty. This is where the shadow begins to matter. The shadow is not just the dark side of a person. It is everything in us that we have not wanted to see, everything we have pushed out of awareness because it felt too painful, too needy, too embarrassing, too vulnerable, too unrefined. In fantasy, the shadow often appears as denial. Denial of the obvious, denial of the imbalance, denial of the fact that the other person is not meeting us in the same place we are meeting them. You may already know this at some level, but knowing it intellectually and feeling it in your bones are two different things. The mind can say, "This is not healthy." The body can still whisper, "But maybe one more day." That whisper is not stupidity, it is attachment. It is the part of the psyche that wants the old wound to finish differently. If you grew up having to earn attention, if love felt inconsistent, if closeness came with uncertainty, if you learned that waiting made you more worthy, then fantasy can feel strangely familiar. Not because it is good for you, but because it matches the emotional architecture you already know. Jung would call this the pull of a complex. A complex is not just a memory, it is an emotional knot. It gathers old experiences, old fears, old expectations, and then reacts as if the present moment is the same as the past. So when someone goes quiet, the complex may not hear silence, it may hear abandonment. When someone stays vague, the complex may not hear ambiguity, it may hear the familiar ache of not being chosen clearly. That is why fantasy is so seductive. It gives the complex a place to live. It says, "See, there is still meaning here. There is still a hidden explanation. There is still a reason to keep waiting. And perhaps there is meaning. But meaning is not the same as denial. Meaning does not require you to distort what is happening. In fact, real meaning asks for more honesty, not less. The fantasy begins to crack when you ask a quieter question. Not, "What do they feel?" but, "What is this doing inside me?" That question changes the entire emotional landscape, because now you are no longer a powerless observer of someone else's behavior. You are a witness to your own inner process. You begin to see that the intensity is not only about them, it is about the part of you that needs them to represent something larger. It is about the part of you that wants one person to resolve an old loneliness. It is about the part of you that hopes this connection will prove you were never too much, never too late, never too difficult, never too ordinary to be deeply loved. There is something tender and tragic in that hope, and there is something liberating in seeing it clearly. This does not mean the feelings were fake. It means the feelings were carrying more than one meaning. That is the nature of projection. Projection does not mean you invented everything. It means your psyche added layers to what was already there. You may have seen real warmth, real chemistry, real potential, real moments of intimacy, but the unconscious may have inflated those moments into destiny, salvation, or completion. That is the fantasy, when a real connection begins to carry an impossible amount of psychological weight. You start expecting one person to do what only your own inner life can do. You expect them to restore your value, to settle your nervous system, to make the past make sense, to confirm that your heart was right to hope, to be the answer to a question that has actually been living inside you for years. And because no human being can carry that much, the relationship begins to feel unstable, not always loudly. Sometimes it looks calm from the outside, but inside, there is a constant oscillation between hope and disappointment, closeness and distance, signs and silence, meaning and doubt. You are not living in a relationship anymore. You are living in interpretation. That is exhausting. And it is also the point where many people mistake intensity for depth. But intensity is not always depth. Sometimes intensity is just unresolved material looking for a face. This is where Carl Jung becomes so useful, because he gives language to something many people feel but cannot name. The psyche seeks wholeness. When something in us is missing, we often look outward for the missing piece. We attach to people who seem to carry the quality we most desire: calm, strength, mystery, warmth, power, freedom, devotion, certainty. In the beginning, this can feel like recognition, and sometimes it is. But recognition can easily become inflation. You do not only see them, you see what you need them to be. That is why leaving the fantasy is not simply about getting over someone. It is about withdrawing the projection. It is about gently taking back the qualities you handed over. The safety you thought only they could provide. The value you thought only they could confirm. The future you thought only they could unlock. And yes, that can feel like losing them twice. First as a person, then as a symbol. But the second loss is the one that frees you. Because as long as the symbol remains untouched, you remain emotionally bound to an image rather than a reality. You keep speaking to the image. You keep hoping the image will become flesh. You keep defending the image against evidence. You keep rescuing the image from the truth. The truth may be simpler than the fantasy, and that simplicity can hurt. Maybe they were inconsistent. Maybe they were emotionally unavailable. Maybe they liked the attention, but not the responsibility. Maybe they had their own fear of intimacy. Maybe they were sincere in some moments and absent in others. Maybe they were never the whole story you made them into. This is not said to shame you. It is said to return you to the ground. Because fantasy often floats above the ground. It lives in what could be, what might be, what was hinted at, what was almost said, what was nearly felt. Reality lives in what is. And what is, even when painful, is the only place where your life can actually happen. There is a strange grief in that realization. Because you may have spent so long feeding the possibility that you forgot how much energy it takes to keep a possibility alive that is not being met. You may have organized your mood around a person who was not organizing their life around you. You may have built quiet rituals of expectation around someone who was simply moving through their own days. The fantasy keeps you in relationship with an absence, and absence, when it is dressed up as mystery, can become addictive. This is why some women do not harden because they are cruel. They harden because they are tired of being pulled into emotional weather that never settles. They become sharp because they have been soft in places that were repeatedly misunderstood. They become guarded because their openness was treated like access. They become distant because closeness was used as a doorway into confusion. But again, hardness is not the only alternative. There is a third path. It is the path of discernment. Discernment says, I can feel deeply without surrendering my judgment. I can miss someone without making them into a myth. I can hold warmth without feeding a fantasy. I can wish them well without assigning them the role of my healing. That is maturity. And maturity is not cold. It is clean. Clean enough to see what is present. Clean enough to notice where you are filling in blanks. Clean enough to stop calling every ache a sign. Clean enough to let a person be what they are, not what your longing needs them to become. The body will resist this at first, because the body was trained by repetition. It remembers the rush of hope, the spike of uncertainty, the relief of imagined closeness. It may even confuse anxiety with connection. For some people, calm feels suspicious, because calm was not the emotional climate of their early life. So when fantasy begins to dissolve, the nervous system can panic. It can say, if I stop imagining, I will lose the bond. But what you lose is not the bond. What you lose is the illusion. And underneath the illusion, there may be a quieter truth waiting for you. Maybe you were not only attached to them, maybe you were attached to the version of yourself who felt alive in the story. That is worth looking at carefully. Because fantasy can make us feel chosen, significant, special, destined, spiritually marked. It can give a lonely life a dramatic center. It can turn ordinary pain into a sacred narrative. And for someone who has felt unseen, that can be intoxicating. Suddenly, your heart is not just hurting, it is meaning. Suddenly, your waiting is not just waiting, it is devotion. Suddenly, your confusion is not confusion, it is evidence that the connection is rare. But rarity is not the same as wholeness. Something can feel extraordinary and still not be right for you. This is one of the hardest lessons of emotional life. We are not only drawn to what is good for us, we are drawn to what is familiar, unfinished, and symbolically charged. That is why fantasy is so powerful. It is not random. It is organized by old emotional logic. It speaks in the language of the unconscious. And the unconscious does not care whether the story is convenient. It cares whether the story fits the wound. So, if you have been living inside a fantasy, the question is not, why am I so foolish? The question is, what wound is asking to be seen through this person? Maybe it is the wound of not being fully chosen. Maybe it is the wound of having to perform to be loved. Maybe it is the wound of believing that if you are patient enough, the unavailable will eventually become available. Maybe it is the wound of mistaking longing for proof. Whatever the wound is, the fantasy is not the cure. It is the costume. And once you see the costume, you can begin to meet the wound directly. That meeting is not dramatic. It is often quiet. It may look like putting the phone down without checking it again for an hour. It may look like noticing the urge to search for signs and not acting on it. It may look like letting a memory be a memory instead of turning it into a prophecy. It may look like allowing the disappointment to exist without immediately covering it with hope. That is not emotional failure. That is emotional honesty. And emotional honesty is the beginning of self-respect. You may need to grieve the fact that a fantasy kept you company. That is real grief. Sometimes a fantasy gives us the sense of being accompanied through a painful season. It lets us feel less alone. It gives the heart a place to rest, even if that place is not real. So, when you release it, the loneliness can feel louder for a while. That does not mean you made a mistake. It means the fantasy had been doing work your life had not yet learned how to do in a healthier way. This is why the process can feel so raw. You are not only losing a person, you are losing a coping strategy. And that is where the shadow often appears again, because the shadow does not only contain darkness, it also contains disowned strength, the strength to face what is unresolved, the strength to stop romanticizing pain, the strength to tolerate the simple truth, the strength to say, I do not need to turn this into a myth in order for it to matter. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private, not for anyone else. Just one sentence that tells the truth without decoration. Because truth, once spoken, begins to loosen the spell. The spell is not broken by contempt, it is broken by clarity. And clarity can be gentle. You do not have to rip the fantasy away with violence. You can let it fade by refusing to feed it. When the mind reaches for the old movie, you bring it back to the body. What do I actually feel right now? Tightness, heat, loneliness, hope, fear, shame, wanting. Breathe there. Not to fix it, just to stop abandoning it. This is a subtle but profound shift. You stop making the fantasy your refuge and start making your own awareness your refuge. That is individuation in plain language. Not becoming detached from life, becoming more whole inside it. Not cutting off feeling, but no longer letting feeling dictate a false reality. Not hardening. Integrating. The heart does not need to become smaller to become wiser. It needs to become less confused, and confusion is often what keeps fantasy alive. A few real moments, a few unanswered questions, a few symbolic coincidences, and suddenly the mind is constructing an entire hidden narrative. The unconscious loves symbols, but the conscious mind must learn to test them. A sign is not a command. A feeling is not always a fact. A connection can be meaningful without being meant to become your future. This is where many people get trapped. They think that because something touched them deeply, it must be destined. But depth is not destiny. It is simply depth. It means the experience reached far enough into your psyche to stir something important. That is valuable. It does not automatically mean it should be pursued forever. Sometimes the most meaningful experiences are the ones that reveal where we are still unfinished. That is why leaving the fantasy can feel like waking up from a dream that was beautiful and painful at the same time. You do not want to insult the dream. You know it was trying to tell you something, but you also know you cannot live inside it. You have a life to return to, a body to inhabit, a morning to face, a room to clean, a meal to eat, a friend to call, a self to reclaim. And slowly, if you let yourself, you begin to notice that your energy changes when you stop feeding the image. You sleep a little deeper. You check the phone a little less. You think about them with less urgency and more perspective. You feel the ache, but it no longer runs the whole house. You stop negotiating with silence. You stop making absence into a sacred language. You begin to remember that your attention is precious. This is one of the most important recoveries a woman can make. Not because attention is magical, but because attention is life. Where you place it, you place your energy. Where you place your energy, you shape your inner world. If your attention is constantly circling a fantasy, your inner world becomes smaller and more dependent on external signs. If your attention comes home, even imperfectly, your inner world starts to breathe again. And when your inner world breathes again, your standards change. You no longer ask, how can I make this story work? You ask, does this story make me more myself or less? That question is a turning point. Because the real measure of any connection is not how much it activates your longing. It is whether it helps you live with more truth, more dignity, more steadiness, more inner room. There are people who will always prefer the fantasy version of you because the fantasy asks for less from them. It asks them to be imagined, not known. It asks them to be projected onto, not encountered. But you are not here to worship a possibility that cannot meet your reality. You are here to belong to yourself, and belonging to yourself may begin with a very small refusal. The refusal to check one more time. The refusal to interpret one more silence. The refusal to romanticize one more inconsistency. The refusal to call a wound a destiny. The refusal to hand your peace over to a person who is not holding it carefully. That refusal can feel almost rude at first, especially if you were trained to be endlessly understanding. But understanding without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Compassion without discernment becomes a trap. Softness without self-respect becomes a door left open in the rain. You do not need to slam the door, you only need to close it. And once it is closed, you may hear your own life more clearly. The sound of your own thoughts, the rhythm of your own day, the quieter voice underneath the fantasy that has been waiting to speak. That voice does not beg, it does not perform, it does not chase. It says, I am here, come back. That is the voice of the self in Jungian language, the deeper center that does not need illusion to survive. The self does not demand that you become hard. It asks you to become whole. It asks you to stop splitting your heart between what you feel and what you know. It asks you to tolerate the disappointment of reality without losing your tenderness. That is a powerful kind of woman, not the woman who never feels, the woman who feels fully and still chooses truth. The woman who can look at a beautiful fantasy and say, you are not my home. The woman who can let a dream end without turning her heart into stone. And if there is still grief in you, let there be grief. Grief is not weakness. Grief is often the last loyalty we offer to what once mattered. It means something in you was alive. It means you cared. It means you hoped. It means you were willing to reach. Do not shame that part of yourself. Just do not let her lead the whole life anymore. Let her sit beside you instead of driving the car. Let the fantasy be what it was, a mirror, a message, a doorway into your own psyche, not a permanent address. You do not need to punish the part of you that believed. You only need to teach her that belief must be joined by reality. That is how the heart stays open without becoming naive. Not by closing, by seeing. Not by freezing, by discerning. Not by becoming less loving, by becoming more truthful about where love actually lives. And love does not live in endless waiting. It does not live in the anxiety of unread messages. It does not live in the exhausting theater of maybe. It lives where there is mutual presence, mutual clarity, mutual responsibility, mutual respect. Everything else may still be meaningful in some way, but it is not a foundation. So tonight, or whenever you feel the old pull again, notice the room, notice the phone, notice the body, notice what fantasy promises you. Then ask whether that promise is bringing you closer to yourself or farther away. That question is enough. You do not have to solve your whole heart in one evening. You do not have to become fully healed in one decision. You only have to stop mistaking the doorway for the house. The doorway was never meant to be lived in, and the house, your real life, has been waiting for you to come back inside. Maybe that is the quiet miracle here. Not that the fantasy disappears forever in one breath, not that the heart never aches again, but that you begin to recognize the ache without obeying it. You begin to see the image without serving it. You begin to feel the longing without letting it write the script. That is freedom. Not hardness. Freedom. My silence is not a game. It is my return to myself. If you need one sentence to carry with you, let it be this. I do not chase what teaches me to abandon myself. And if the phone stays silent tonight, let it. The silence is not empty anymore. It is space. Space for your own voice to return. Space for the body to soften. Space for the heart to remember that it was never meant to live inside a fantasy forever. It was meant to come home.